So we are back here on Influence and Impact, continuing the Hot Rod History series. We're getting into basically the birth of street rodding. There's several branches of the hot rod tree. We've touched on the land speed stuff, the drag racing, the customs, the kind of true hot rods. But street rods is something that kind of seemed to come about more a little bit in the 70s, I think.
Yeah, this is kind of exciting for me because this is kind of my era when I was born and grew up around kind of some of these cars. So to me, I do remember a lot of this stuff pretty well here. But that also, too, the street rod thing kind of came from the custom rodder thing that was happening before. And obviously there was a magazine called Custom Rodder Magazine for the 50s. But that magazine was kind of East Coast, and everyone kind of knows the car culture that was kind of out of touch at the time. So
well, and that's Rod and Custom magazine, stuff like that came out in the 50s, early 50s.
Correct.
And yeah, now you're 20 years later, kind of the cycle of hot rods, a lot of it had kind of gone through where if you were a 18-year-old, 16-year-old kid in the 60s, chances are you were going to get a muscle car.
Well, right.
And cruise that down the boulevard.
Yeah.
You weren't necessarily thinking about getting a Model A or a Model T bucket to, hit the boulevard. You were getting a Camaro or you were getting a Chevelle or a Mustang.
Right. Well, and I don't think they had a chance because, really kind of popular culture was forcing it down their throat. You had, like the Beach Boys making Little Deuce Coupe and 409 in the mid 60s.
Yeah.
And then you've got, all these other movies and TV shows that are showing cars. Look at George Barris had 3 or 4 cars on TV every night.
Well, and that's, so that Barris came from that custom world, and we talked about him, him and his brother Sam in the last episode. But yeah, as the 60s went on, he was basically more or less being just contracted by movies and TV production companies to make, the Dragula and,
right.
The Green Hornet car and
Batmobile, yeah.
obviously.
Right.
So these were very out of the box, wild creations. Same thing with Roth and, those guys where it was like, the domed, finned, rocket-looking cars. So like the custom stuff and the custom rods went very out of this world,
there you
truthfully, because this was, that time period. But like everything, there's a cycle of street rods or hot rods kind of coming back in the early 70s. But if you really think about it, muscle cars, it's the same recipe that Detroit followed as the same, deal as the hot rods. A Mustang, that was the small secretary's car, but hey, let's put a bigger engine in it,
right,
and sell it to a young kid.
Yeah,
that's a hot rod.
Oh, totally.
But we're sticking with the traditional kind of Model A's, 32 Deuces, Model T's, that kind of more hot rod, and where that kind of went, and it kind of got into interesting a little bit, and kind of some new faces, new people started to pop up as well,
right,
during this time.
Well, I kind of think this too is that it's a little generational because some of the older guys that got into this deal maybe in the 40s or the 50s, they had kind of generationed themselves out because that's 20 years ago.
Well, now
some of those guys, right?
Now they've got kids, or there's a younger generation that's coming up,
and not only that, then you look at car shows. Well, a car show is about outdoing each other. So of course, little by little, the hot rods became more street rods because guys would chrome a little more, or maybe paint a little bit more. They got a little nicer. Their displays got nicer.
Yeah, they weren't the jalopies,
right,
and the Dry Lake Racers and stuff anymore. But
right,
these were high end, hot rods.
The old T-shirt. What's the difference between a hot rod and a street rod? Lounge chairs and a toolbox, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of lets you know that these guys were like, hey, I'm going to build something that is definitely purpose built, but I want it to be better than my competitor.
Yeah, I want it to look good.
Right.
Still got to perform. But not necessarily racing it, but it's more going to be a boulevard cruiser, or, and going to shows and stuff like that. And a lot of, being that a lot of the, by this time in the mid to late 60s, your 29 Model A is 30
years old.
30 years old.
Yeah. Right.
But it's,
it's a 30-year-old car.
It's a 30-year-old car, and it's also, 1930s technology.
Right.
And so a lot of the companies that we saw, with Volkswagens, but also with some of the, crazy, hot rods and stuff were starting to build, kits or like kit cars. So like, okay, yeah, you can take your frame, but you don't have to find an old rusted, deuce body. You can make a fiberglass one.
Exactly.
Or you can put a fiberglass one on a chassis,
or you can make a configuration that never existed.
Exactly, too.
And make that all of a sudden something that someone can buy. And that was the good thing, is that towards the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, you had more people that were making manufacturing parts for guys, so you didn't have to go find the super rare items that you weren't going to find, or you didn't have to be a machinist to make something go fast.
Well, and a lot of people, even looking at some older articles, seemed like a lot of people in the early 70s thought that all the good bodies were all used up.
Right.
They couldn't find them, or, because it's like, this is pre-internet,
Yeah, you're looking through the newspaper and
looking for the newspaper
ads,
or driving down a country road, and, there's stuff stashed away that you might not get to. So a lot of people were turning towards, those kit cars, basically.
Exactly.
I mean, even like one of the most, well-known, hot rod guys, Brizio.
Yeah.
That's kind of how he got his start and his fame was, making a kit.
I mean, after winning AMBR with the Instant T, it made sense for him to make that style of car.
Yeah.
And why not duplicate the car that won Oakland Roadster Show?
Yeah, you can replicate that, and people can buy it and put their own spin on it and go from there.
And Andy was a pretty well-known figure, though, too. I mean, when he won the Oakland Roadster Show, I want to say 63, maybe, don't quote me. But anyway, that kicked off a lot of different cars. And for the San Francisco area, he's known as the Rod Father, but for the San Francisco area, he was in Champion Speed Shop was the place to go. So that also kind of is something a little bit different from, we always talk about Southern California guys. All of a sudden now it's starting to expand.
Everything has expanded with this hot rod stuff. And now you're starting to get then those guys that are in other areas kind of creating their own style or their own,
And of course, the Myers-Manx was really popular with the Volkswagen guys, where you could take a Volkswagen and cut it down and make it into a little dune buggy. Super cool.
Yeah.
Well, the street rod guys got into it too, because T-buckets, which was something that wasn't really kind of ever made, if you think about it.
No, I mean, it's,
like Ford didn't really make a T-bucket, but they made it model after the brass age cars. So that's why you'd have like the T-buckets with the giant brass headlights and the brass radiators, but they would have bigs and littles like a drag car.
Yeah. So it would look like a hot rod version of a, 1914 car or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And they were lower to the ground, and they usually had a fully exposed motor. Well, always had a fully exposed motor, but that also allowed guys to bolt on chrome stuff. So that's where all this started to kind of make like flash, and also got other people involved that you wouldn't think were regular hot rodders, because some guys would think like, they might be an engineer or something like that working for an aircraft company, but to them, they're like, I'm not a mechanic, but hey, I saw this in Popular Mechanics, so I can build this.
Yeah.
So
no, if you're selling a kit car,
right.
and even back to the Myers-Manx thing, then Brizio did make a Volkswagen where you could have a Volkswagen specific truck.
The Volksrod.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you could have basically the bed of the T-bucket truck or the Model T truck is what housed the Volkswagen engine.
Right.
And then, but you just close off the front end, versus having an exposed, make
like a little track,
flathead
like
or
a track roadster out of it. Yeah.
But that's, guys were getting creative and they were doing stuff, but it was interesting too, because a lot of those guys, if let's say they had a fiberglass body on there, or it was, they were mixing and matching parts, they would then put Jenny parts or genuine parts on, maybe as a little bit of a way to kind of legitimize it. Or also just maybe people weren't making, reproduction bumpers or headlights or something, but hey, go grab a bumper that's all messed up off of a car. You can't save the car, or there's a bunch of bumpers lying around, but clean those up and use them on a kit car with, a fiberglass body. And you kind of have something that more or less, unless you really knew and looked very closely, it just looked like a great little hot rod.
Well, and that's everyone was trying to build imposters. So again, too, because like you mentioned, the country road cars. The problem with country road cars are people use them as target practice. So you can have start out with a pristine car that's out, left out there for 10 years, and some kid comes by with a shotgun and pumps the thing full of buckshot. And that's kind of what a lot of those cars looked like. So it made sense let's build fiberglass molds and let's build these fiberglass cars and, let people buy them. And like I was mentioning, T-buckets, look, there were 4 of my friends' parents that had those cars growing up. I mean, they were all over the place. And it seemed like all the time. I mean, they're in movies. I mean, I can totally remember Hollywood Nights. They had a T-bucket in it. And that kind of stuff was just,
I mean, it's basically fun. Like a street legal go-kart.
I know,
really
right?
Looked at it.
Yeah. And they're sketchy. I mean, they have the big
the
crazy old
steering wheel.
The big old truck steering wheel, like the Mack truck steering wheel that was like reversed with a big old giant nut on the top of it. And they always kind of looked like German helmets. I always thought that was kind of funny. They looked like a
I see what you're saying. You had because it had that little spike on there.
Yeah, and they had the tops that would come over that had a giant big
I think
vinyl top.
And I think there has been a few of those
with
cars or maybe
cross.
cartoons that have had the helmet on.
Right. They totally do. So, but that it struck a craze. However, to traditional guys, let's talk about the traditional guys that they were finding things.
There's always a an opposite or a cycle back. So you're gonna have all these crazy high dollar custom street rods, being built, or these kit cars being built. There's going to be people, younger guys usually, that like the older stuff or want to find the older stuff or can't maybe make the new fancy stuff, so they're going to, kind of do it themselves.
Or they want the Jenny.
They don't want to be, and that's what's funny is we're talking about the 60s and 70s. I remember same conversations happening or hearing them in late 90s 2000s when you had all the 37 kit car bodies and stuff like that, or you had a Brooksville steel body but it was a repo,
right?
And people were like, oh well, that's not a real hot 32 because that's a kit car. Anyone could build a kit car, and it's like, sure, but it's also like,
so but that's also one that when people talk about Henry Ford bodies, they'd ask you, like, is that a Henry car?
Yeah,
and that terminology did come up because they wanted to know if that's an original car. So I mean, the kit cars were fun, but the guys that were after the genuine stuff, there was, like you mentioned, there was an abundance of parts, but a very difficult way of finding these parts. So it was like either classifieds, yard sales, an uncle that knows a guy, a swap meet, some car shows, but it was difficult to find parts. You had things like Hemmings, where you would kind of list things, but a farmer doesn't really know what Hemmings is. So a lot of it was just driving around.
Might be their local newspaper that, maybe only 1,000 people are going to see. And of those, 2 guys maybe are into cars or into that, looking for what you got.
Right.
So,
and I know a lot of people,
tougher.
And I know a lot of West Coast people say, like, well, the recycler didn't happen until the 80s.
Yeah.
So this was still,
we're talking 60s and 70s still.
Right. Yeah. So it was tough to find this, but the other thing too is pop culture kind of dragged people back into it too, because I mean, look, in the early 70s, American Graffiti came out.
Yeah.
And American Graffiti was obviously the first kind of like throwback, like,
it was to call it like 1973 movie
about 1962.
Based in, an older time period. And that was based in Modesto,
right?
Which is obviously Central California, farm country, but had a huge, car culture and cruising culture, and that's where George Lucas grew up. So for him, that was nostalgia.
Right.
That's what you're going to get then with your younger guys in the 70s that want some of that nostalgia.
Right. And I know everybody too, like of course, the hero car of that movie is John Milner's coupe.
Yeah.
But there's still, Ron Howard drives that really cool 58 Chevy. That's just a perfect street custom for the time. And then Harrison Ford's 55 Chevy, which is the same 55 Chevy from Two Lane Blacktop, but it was reverse chrome, wheels, the whole 9 yards. It was true to that period. So those guys watching that, they might have been a little bit younger for those days. They might not have been high school or driving age in 62. They might have been 10 or 15.
Yeah, they were young kids, maybe they remember a little bit. But yeah.
So when they got older and now it's time for them to build cars, they start going back to what they saw in the movies.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, you were either kind of at that point, the muscle cars in the early 70s, like a new one, were kind of getting a little bit weird, and you had the gas crunch, and the muscle cars kind of died out by the early 70s by that time. So if you're wanting that raw power or that feel, then you might go back to the hot rods or the older cars. What's interesting is looking up some photos and looking some information on like the Milner Coupe, is that people call it ugly.
Right. And it's not everybody's favorite.
It's not everybody's favorite. I think more or less it's just not, there's for a, deuce coupe or 3-window coupe or a, whatever, there's like a certain recipe that like just looks good.
Right.
And they just that was a custom hot rod for the time. So yeah, you're going to throw some extra stuff on there. Like it had rear fenders on there, kind of bobbed fenders.
Right.
And, you know,
well, that was all the ticket stuff. If you look at that car, that car was very
makes sense.
Well, that car was very time period because it's not channeled over the frame. Yeah. It's got a funky grill. It's got fenders on it. And obviously in the movie, how he gets pulled over all of the time, you can tell that all of that stuff was all, and it was all ticket proof. Right.
Yeah.
But
so yeah, it was all the CHP and everybody going after the hot rodders in the 50s. And of course there's safety laws in the 60s that come around.
And we also have to remember too, that so many other super cool coupes came after the Milner coupe. So to look back at it now, you look at oh, that coupe looks stupid. No, that coupe looks rad for 1962. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing too, is like, it's always, that's the whole point of customizing cars and hot rods. Put your own spin on it and your own thing. It's just, we've kind of established now, like a 32 Highboy has a certain look,
right?
And this one's a little bit off from it, but yeah, that definitely, you know, set the stage as one of the most iconic kind of hot rod movies,
right?
Especially for that time, because there was a handful of other ones, but those were always more muscle car, chase movies,
right?
And you know, cop movies and that kind of stuff.
Well, but that was the same thing. The Hollywood Machine kept that kind of car culture going, because
it just shifted
worked.
Maybe to the muscle cars, and bigger cars, but then now we started to go back to the hot rods,
right. Well, if we're going to talk about that, and let's stay on deuces. Well, it's not really a deuce; it's 34. But we could talk about, you know, Pete Shaporis' California Kid that he built with Jake Jacobs, and that's
and those are a couple key guys that you know we really want to touch on and give some background. And you know, Pete would hang out at Blair's Speed Shop, which we had mentioned has been around one of the first speed shops, and that's where he was hanging out, and he ran into the whole T-bucket thing. That's what he had first.
Yeah, it's crazy, huh?
Yeah.
You know, but that's something that he had, that T-bucket that, you know, obviously was hanging out at Blair's and, you know, was running into Jake. And those guys, of course, kind of had the same ideas, the same cars, you know, stuff to build. Of course, Jake had built a bunch of other cars before.
Yeah. But and that's Jake Jacobs.
That's right.
But that's the Pete and Jake's.
Yes.
You know, that we'll talk about. And then later, Pete Shaporis went on to revive SoCal Speed Shop with Alex Exidius much later on.
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, when Pete had an idea of that car. Like, he wanted a 34 three-window coupe forever. Mm-hmm. And finally found one because a local drag racer actually turned him on to it. And so, you know.
And that was Randy Troxel, who's pretty well known.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he found one. They found one out, and I think it was by Pasadena. I want to say like Glendora or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of cool because I was just reading about this the other day. Like, there's on Pete and Jake's website, there's an actual letter that Pete wrote about this car.
That's cool. Yeah.
And it was super cool how they went through, like, how he found it. You know, obviously, you know, found it from Randy. How Pete and Jake got together. They were building the car. And from what I hear, from what the letter states, is that he took the engine and transmission out of the T-bucket along with the wheels and tires to keep it for his coupe.
Mean, that's what we're talking about. This is early 70s, so 30 years old. So who knows? He might not have it might not have had, like, Randy might have already robbed the motor out of it that was in that 34.
Right.
Like, it might have not have had all of those parts, or might have just been a body or something. So, but yeah. And what's interesting on that, and we'll talk a little bit about the production of the TV movie and stuff like that with California Kid. But so you mentioned that the engine drivetrain is out of his T-bucket.
Right.
When they actually show it in the movie, it's actually a close-up of the Milner Coupe's engine from American Graffiti.
What?
And the audio is from a big block Corvette.
What, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
And that's because, I guess,
movie magic?
For whoever the producer, director, whoever it was, I guess, the motor didn't look big enough and didn't sound big enough to be a hot rod. When it's like, okay, now this is one of the most iconic hot rods of all time.
Right.
But it wasn't good enough, you know, for TV.
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, they had their work cut out because they were building that car at the time, and Gray Baskerville actually kind of leaked it with. They had a cover where they had Pete and Jake's both of their coupes on the cover, Rod and Custom, and I want to say like it was
74,
74,
late 74,
right?
or
no,
it was December 73.
73,
so,
right.
Late 73.
So the television producer that did the California Kid, he actually saw that magazine cover, and of course, you know, had his people figure out whose cars those were. And they called over to Pete and Jake's shop, which they had just started. And literally they said, like, we need the California Kid, but we need it like Friday. Like they did like one of those, like, you got like 24 hours to make this car happen.
I like how, the guy, if they're trying to find the car, the title car for a new movie, and they still haven't found it 4 days before production.
So what? We'll let it roll.
Yeah, we'll find something.
Right. But I mean, they did him a favor though, too, about that, because of course, you know, Martin Sheen was the actor of that. And he had, you know, been an up and coming actor at that time.
Yeah.
But ABC's like movie of the week, which used to be a thing, because remember, we didn't have cable TV in the 70s.
Yeah, no, that's that Friday night or Saturday night movie was a thing. Yeah.
And that was one of their biggest ones of the 70s. Like it was hugely popular. So it made, you know, that car change overnight into stardom.
Yeah.
But the really cool thing is that Universal actually allowed them to use in their advertising Home of the California Kid. So for those guys, you know, they immediately went into a newer magazine called Street Rodder. We'll talk about that in a sec. And they started advertising their parts that they made, because they had to make a lot of those handmade parts for that, because again, it was a hot rod. It wasn't just a 34 that I put a motor and trans in. No, like they still had to lower it. It was a full fendered car. They had to make the thing sit right, the stance, and that's where honestly.
And the flames. I mean, those are a pretty iconic
flames too.
The flame job on there, and the little script of the California Kid on there.
Yeah.
What's interesting, just going back real quick on that Rod and Custom cover, is so there's like, you know, a farm girl and a chicken coop, and the whole joke of it, and Gray Bassville was definitely a comedy kind of guy of this. It was basically like, can coupes be hot rods? Right. Basically, because at the time, you know, we talked about coupes getting a little bit popular earlier on, but still like your T-Bucket or your Roadster was still the hot rod. Right. That cover of Rod and Custom, you know, kind of really gave them a Pete and Jake with their own shop starting up, a big bump. Obviously, California Kid, even more so. But at that same time, you know, in 1970, you had the Street Rod Nationals. That show was starting up,
and that's the NS. I can never.
Well,
say
now
that right.
The National Street Rod Association. Yes. But the Street Rod Nationals, and at the time it was the Rod and Custom Street Rod Nationals. Okay. Obviously, that the magazine. Yeah. You know, published it or sponsored it. Right. And then a couple years later, you had Street Rodder magazine. Right. That was introduced. So, kind of the term hot rod had obviously grown to encompass everything, and so the term street rodding was starting to come about in the early 70s to kind of pinpoint a specific type of car. Right, which again, too, it kind of goes back to what we think of like the Hot Rod Power Tour, which a lot of the hot rods and coupes, hot rods and roadsters you'd see at the dry lakes, they might have been towed there, or they might have been trailered there because they were they're race cars. Yeah. But street rods were about driving your car a distance. Mm-hmm. So no, and so the guys that were putting on, you know, or the guys from Rod and Custom magazine were encouraging the guys like Brizio and the guys from the West Coast to go and drive their hot rods out to the event. Right. And one of the guys that I think really capitalized on that was Tom McMullen, because clearly, I mean, he already had built a car, his Tom McMullen Roadster, that had been in numerous TV shows and numerous, you know, record album covers. It was in a few movies, you know, that kind of stuff. So it was a well-known car. And Tom looked at that opportunity to start a magazine that was actually focused on stuff that his friends were building. So he's the guy that started Street Rodder magazine. Yeah. And when that's kind of the competitor version to answer to Rod and Custom hot rod, kind of that combo. Yeah. And I mean, both of them, Tom was, you know, knew who Robert Peterson was and knew what the Peterson gang was all about. So he just kind of went the opposite direction. And you'll see that even too in Tom's builds, because even though, so Tom McMullen's Roadster is supposed to be known as the first Roadster to have a Chevy small block in it. It's not true, but it was credited for that, right? Mm-hmm. And he was an innovative guy, though. He was a guy that a 283 with 6 Strombergs, you know, it seems like a pretty healthy thing to drive around, until he windows the block and says, I'm going to put a blower on it. He was that guy, which always was bigger and better. Just always going, stepping it up. And he did that with challenging himself, challenging a builder, whoever's building it. Yeah. Right. And he did that with Street Rodder magazine. And he got, you know, the guys of the day that were kind of his, you know, people, and started not only that, but he went on to start other magazines like, you know, Street Chopper magazine, Truckin' magazine. Yeah. You know, that kind of stuff all happened right around that time period. Yeah. That mid 70s and early 70s, mid 70s. Yeah.
Right. So things were exploding. And the good thing about that is that got more people into the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to see not just an Andy Brizio car anymore. You're going to also see other people popping up, like a guy named Little John Patera. And he was kind of known more as a race car driver. I'm sorry.
Builder. Yeah. He was building a lot of the chassis and doing some of the engineering work on like Don Prudhomme's funny car and Don Schumacher's, you know, the Stardust and stuff like that. And
he's also building Indy cars.
And
in the middle of the 70s, he's building Indy cars.
And that's the thing too. Like you look at his list of everything, like he's just engineer, machinist guy that just tell me something to do and I got it.
Out of a garage.
You know, yeah.
As well.
Well, and that's what, you know, we had all the speed shops that popped up, you know, by this time SEMA's rocking and rolling.
Right.
You know, a lot of companies and manufacturers are making speed parts, you know, but some of these young guys, these builders are just now they're got to start in your garage.
Right.
Got to start somewhere.
Well, I mean, and no doubt, John was a Batera.
He was. Yeah. Actually, he was.
Thank God he was.
Yeah. That's his last name.
Yeah. But he was a machinist. So to him, he could bring machines to his house, work at his house. His customers would show up. That's how he got started. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to see what he built because, I mean, like Don Prudhomme, like you mentioned, Don Prudhomme's car, like it's the Hot Wheel white snake duster. It's not like one of his cars that didn't do well. It's like the one that made Don Prudhomme famous, right? And like you mentioned too, the Stardust car, Don Schumacher. I mean, that brought Don Schumacher a championship. So he was building competitive race cars, breaking limits, and he's still over here making street rods, right?
Well, and maybe you can correct me on this. This is what I was kind of reading a little bit, is that by the mid 70s, some of the drag racing stuff had kind of died out for him, and it had kind of gotten us like stale a little bit.
Yeah.
So now let me start doing street rods, or let me keep doing or amplify, you know, what I'm doing in the street rod world, and you know, for certain customers. And so one of his early cars, you know, and it was kind of coined for his term versus like we mentioned with the kit cars and the brass chrome and, you know, headlights and bumpers and stuff. His was subtle creativity.
There you go.
Was kind of what the magazines were calling, you know, John Butera's. And so he had a 26 Ford two-door sedan,
right?
Which is not exactly what you would think of when you say hot rod, but that's what happens when everyone else is buying up a 32 or even a T-bucket.
Right.
Go for the obscure.
Yep.
And make it something cool. But yeah, that was 1974 when he came out with his, you know, two-door sedan.
Right. Well, events also kind of helped out these guys as well, because I mentioned like before, it was kind of really difficult to find parts and or cars. So that's why people started kind of trying to get people together. And, you know, I know we keep kind of bringing up Andy Brizio's name, but for kind of good reason, because Andy actually started a picnic, and it was a family event. Bring your hot rod, bring your family. They did cookouts. But this started out as a very small event and became a humongous, giant thing for everyone to come every year to this event. So much so that the magazines, of course, were always on top of it and always covering that. But it inspired other events. And here we go again. We're talking about Tom McMullen, where he started an event down here in Orange County called Tom's Fun Run. And that was kind of a hybrid of like what was called a rally.
Yeah.
Which, again, in the 70s, that kind of stuff was kind of popuar.
Yeah.
So
yeah, van rallies, biker rallies.
Totally.
Yeah.
You know, truck runs, that kind of stuff. And it was your typical rally thing where you'd have to go from spot to spot to spot. And then there was a destination.
Mm-hmm. And party and all that.
Yeah. So those events, that's when all that kind of stuff started, because of course, on the other side of the fence, you had the, you know, convention centers that had the autoramas, the RG canning shows, or, you know, like a Blackie Ajijian, you know, autoramas up there in Fresno and Sacramento.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff also got super big because they were giving away a lot of money. You know, car shows back then paid money. And that's, I know to us today, we like look at that and go, you can win money out of this deal?
No, and some still do, like the Roadster show,
right,
and all that, you know, stuff they still do. But yeah, it made it, and that's what too, you know, and it still does to a degree. But if you went and won Best of Show, you at least got a good chunk of money that covered the cost of whatever you were doing, and you probably then got a customer to build the car to compete the next year.
Hopefully.
that's always usually the goal.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I mean, guys like that though, that it became some guys' careers. I mean, we might be jumping a little bit out of turn out of this deal, but Boyd Coddington built a center door T in '76 that went on to win a whole bunch of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's when he's working and everyone knows he worked at Disneyland.
Yeah,
so
and he was a machinist.
He was a machinist at Disneyland.
So it's that same thing with him and John Butera. Then obviously partnered up.
Right.
John did a lot of the machining work, either for Boyd or with Boyd. A lot of the design work, but you kind of look at it as, okay, if old parts are harder to come by,
right,
and maybe a younger guy in his garage can't either afford or doesn't want to get some fiberglass car or some,
right,
buy some, new car. Well, if you're a machinist and you have that knowledge and that expertise, you could just machine it out of raw aluminum,
right,
and have your, kind of race car suspension or your billet wheel and your accessories and all that stuff, just machine one-off stuff.
Well, I think too with those guys, the other thing too is it was just time for change.
And that's, yeah.
Because, like we mentioned before, street rod kind of equals chrome. So throughout the late 60s and early 70s, most of the 70s, everything was chrome.
Yeah.
And you had gadgets, gizmos, all of the extra stuff that you would put on a car that we would think of like how lowriders, like they try to accessorize the hell out of
the bomb kind of style.
Right. What Boyd and little John Butera did is they were like, strip all that stuff off, make this thing like the line of the car.
Yeah.
It's
a little bit of that traditional aspect, although they kind of called these like high tech rods, and then later billet rods, and then these are what became the fancy street rods, like everything does. But if you look at it as, the guys in the 30s and the 40s were stripping everything off and going bare bones, and that's what created the style of the hot rod. So it's kind of like almost going back to that, but then adding a little bit of the modern touch and the modern performance.
Right.
Guess what? That's hot rodding.
It's hot rodding. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Exactly.
Now, the crazy thing about those guys,
and they live kind of
they
all
lived
in
the same
area.
block.
Yeah.
I mean, they were not same street side, but like you would go around the block, and Little John lived here and Boyd lived here.
Yeah. And wasn't there another guy that
Pete Chaporis?
That's what
lived
it was.
2 blocks away from
that's
them.
What it was. Yeah.
So that's what's crazy. You got the 3 like masters of their craft at the time, and they all live in Orange, or basically
Orange, Winter Park, Anaheim. Yeah.
Right. So
Disneyland adjacent.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Yeah.
But good for them. And I mean, it's kind of funny that when both of us have talked to Chris Coddington before, he has flat out said, I just thought everybody's dad had a hot rod. He didn't know any different.
Well, that's, because and this was that was at the house that was kind of before the Boyd garage,
right.
Where he had a business out of his home.
Yeah.
But it's just a regular little 50s era ranch home track community. Yeah. But if you were running around on that block, every driveway had a hot rod in it.
It's crazy, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, Donnie McNeil, he had a place called Saks Street Rods that was in Orange, California. He had that from I think they opened it up in the 70s, and I think he sold it in maybe 91. So, but it was a full-blown large shop. I mean, 3 or 4 different units of storefront that sold hot rod parts.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the only guy around there. I mean, there's Daigle's that was later on in the 80s, but he came from working over at C.W. Moss.
Yeah. And that's in Old Town Orange
right.
and stuff. Yeah.
So that kind of stuff really brings the nostalgia.
So that's
out of these.
and that's what's kind of interesting, because we've talked about the different areas of Southern California of like, okay, South Bay, the Linwood, Southgate, then we've got the Burbank and Hollywood, and so now we're in our Orange County area?
We're moving to Orange County, right? Right? But it made sense because those guys had families. I mean, for the most part, they were your average working guy. So why not have a nice couple-bedroom house with a big garage? Because those garages were 3-car garages too.
Yeah.
That's what was cool about those.
Yeah, so you can more or less set up a shop and stuff in there. So, but let's jump a little bit into, what Boyd and Little John did together, because that really set the stage for what is kind of the next almost 30 years of hot rods.
Right. And I mean, okay, we know that they're credited as being the first billet wheel manufacturer.
Because at the time, everything was pretty much cast,
or you had a lot of wire spokes.
Or wire, yeah. And a lot of the street rods in the 70s went back to the wires.
Yeah.
Whereas like guys went away from that because of trying to go faster and having more reliability, but they kind of went back to the wires.
And also the Jaguar rear end kind of made that happen.
They did put that on several cars.
Yeah. That was part of the deal because it was really hard to get a Holobrand or, well, this is even before center lines. It was difficult to get wheels on the Jaguar bolt circle. So you would have to use a Jaguar bolt circle, which Jaguars were all wire wheels.
Yeah. You'd have to have a Jaguar wheel.
Right.
Yeah.
So you'd have to have somebody make you a wider wheel because those Jaguar wheels are like 6.5.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted an 8-inch wheel or a 10-inch wheel, you'd have to go to a wheel manufacturer or, a guy that would lace wheels
and have it custom done.
Have it custom done to put on your Jaguar.
But if you can do machined center instead of the wires,
right,
and then a 2-piece, bolt together.
Well, at first, too,
or he was even a center,
right? Yeah. Well, that was also too due to little John Patera was building a lot of Indy cars, and the Indy cars had already gone to the center nut hold on there. So to them, they're like, okay, we'll do a center lug.
Yeah,
it'll look totally different from everyone else. Make these things out of billet. Now we got to be very careful on this one because when we say the word billet, all of us have picked up a billet wheel before, and it's like, oh, that's not that much. They were building wheels out of one piece of aluminum. So the hoop, the center, the whole thing was one piece of aluminum, like a giant chunk.
And this was computer controlled, so they were more or less hand milling and lathing and machining down a several
giant
100-pound chunk of aluminum, a billet of aluminum. That's the term.
Yes.
You could have a billet of steel. You could have a billet of iron, a billet of anything. Machine that down to that lightweight wheel.
So they weren't as light as you think because the early wheels weighed about 75 pounds.
Wow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, they were serious.
And these were what, 15s?
Yeah, 15s. So that...
But that was because, they didn't have necessarily the engineering or the computer technology to, make it as thin as possible.
Yep.
And,
yeah, so it was pretty insane. But then they didn't stop there, too, to them, because, again, it was that less is more thing. They wanted to remove all of the tchotchkes off of the car. So you would have, Little John's car, has I think it's the gray and green Roadster. I forgot which one that was called, but he was the one that put aluminum trim down the side. Yeah. And it was all hand, made, beautiful for,
Yeah, and you could do on the valve covers, do a little accent piece.
Right.
And then obviously later on they started making everything, gauge panels and bezels and door handles and all that.
And they also showed up and took some trophies home because, like you had mentioned, the idea is to try to get someone to, be your customer if you're winning a car show. And sure enough, that's where, Boyd found Jamie Musselman.
Yeah.
Well, before then, he found Vern Luce. So, and Vern Luce was a candy manufacturer that wanted a hot rod built and commissioned him to do that.
Yeah, and from what we've heard from Diane, Boyd's second wife.
Yeah.
But Chris's and Greg's, mom, and the one that was classically on the TV show yelling at everybody.
Yes.
And but she was the money lady, the accountant.
She's actually really nice.
No, and that's the thing. She is, but
but on TV they make her look like the dragon
everything
lady.
on that TV show, they made everybody look more than what they were.
Yeah.
But I remember her saying that he just liked to hang out.
Yep.
He would come home, he owned the candy company and he would make custom Boyd candies and and he just liked hanging out with those guys and wanted a hot rod.
Right. So they built that coupe and they took it to the Oakland Roadster Show.
Yeah.
Again, it's a coupe, so it wasn't up for the AMBR, but it went up for the Schlonaker, which of course it won the Schlonaker.
Yeah. And we've done some documentary stuff with Chris on that of kind of like the birth of Smooth and that iconic Boyd look kind of being born with that car, where it is very stripped down and linear kind of style.
Right. And that's something that even Little John had been doing too before because even he built a 32 that had a Porsche engine in it, a Porsche 928 engine. Mm-hmm. And it was very Indy inspired too. It had like a 5-spoke center bolt. I think it was on the cover of Hot Rod magazine even. But, that thing, again, was that ultra rod, that,
the high
tech,
more modern rod for that mid to late 70s era.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it changed the world too.
Yeah. And the best quote is, and who knows if it's an actual, I don't really know if it's an actual quote or who said it, or if it's just kind of the general idea, but that coupe's so nice. If you would have cut the top off, you would have won.
Oh
amber.
no, that's not a.
So was that an actual?
That was an actual quote.
100%
Yeah,
quote
yeah, and Boyd did exactly that. He
Yeah.
came back the next year with Jamie Musselman's car.
Yeah, he didn't chop the top off
Right.
of the Verne Luce coupe. That one remained and got restored and went to Australia and all that. But the Jamie Musselman's Roadster is then very similar, still that
Very
Boyd
similar.
red,
Right.
Paint job. But the Roadster equivalent equivalent of that,
Right.
and he won amber the next year.
Yeah, which that was 82, I believe.
Yeah, 82 or 83.
Yeah.
So this is
the Sarunians, they won 81 AMBR, which they had a coupe that had a Dan Gurney all aluminum small block Ford that was blown, so it's got a Gurney V8 in it. And if you look at that car, it's the whole entire engine's chrome.
yeah.
Right, it's got like a burgundy color to it, and it's got hollow brands at the centers, kind of painted that same burgundy, but it looks like a 70s car.
Yeah.
Like you look at it and you kind of go, yeah.
You can tell there. Okay, here's a difference.
Right.
Here's a transition into a new style and a new era, more or less.
Because I mean, if you look at them, Jamie's car is brighter red. It's still it's still a Roadster, but looks nothing like Sarunian's car.
Yeah.
Just
the overall vibe of it too
Yeah.
is going to be a different look and a different style.
Yeah.
But that's what then. Yeah, you started to see another explosion of hot rods and street rods, basically, in that time period.
Oh yeah.
And that
Fat Jack, which
yeah.
took like, you're talking about obscure cars, and we've been talking a lot about early iron, but Fat Jack took the cars that nobody wanted. 46 Fords,
the fat fender cars,
44 Deluxes. Like, no, who wants those? But boom, he found a niche and went right after it. And those cars became super popular as well, because you could put your family in them now. So the guys that, kind of always wanted a Roadster or a Deuce, they're like, well now I got
we
two
saw
Rugrats.
Kind of a little bit of the similar thing with the Mercs and the some of the 40s cars and the coupes that were becoming popular around the 40s and 50s. And
right.
Yeah. So then he's kind of, okay, yeah, you're going after that same, Deuce Roadster. Well, I want to go after the big cars,
right?
The big body cars.
And I mean, let's also not forget that drag racing still kind of had an influence on some of these guys. I mean, like, for example, Fat Jack's first 46 was a drag car and had that low slung look, that rake look, the bigs and littles. Like that was, kind of the way that people wanted their cars to look.
For racing, yeah.
Right. But they still wanted to drive them on the streets. So hence the term street rod. And Fat Jack was another guy that took off with the whole mail order or catalog kind of buys too through the magazines, where he would advertise parts for sale for these guys to go find the tub cars and put them together and drive them on the street.
Well, and that's the thing. It's kind of taking that same racing or hot rod, street rodding style and mentality and just applying it to a different vehicle that not everybody's doing. You know, like you say, we did that with Fat Jack, and that's. You still had like the, Boyd obviously got even bigger, started doing the mail order, billet wheels, all those parts. There's ZZ Top's, music videos. Pete Chapuris, cars and stuff in there. Like all that stuff still, went. And then, you kind of then had the guys that were taking the billet and the modern style of stuff and applying it to maybe a muscle car.
Right.
And kind of going with that. So everything kind of flows and follows along with each other. So I think for the next episode, I think obviously we're getting into the 80s, maybe into the 90s a little bit, but I think definitely this is then obviously the explosion of the Boyd look, but also kind of the antithesis of that. You had the street machines.
Yes.
I mean, those were loud, obnoxious, flashy,
they even called them, yes, they even called them street freaks.
Street freaks, yeah. Because these were,
just something that would look like a Hot Wheel.
Well, the paint jobs looked very dragsters from the 60s.
Right.
You had all your chroming and all that stuff from the street rods of the early 70s.
And usually a blower that you couldn't make a right turn because you couldn't see the curb.
Yeah. So they weren't necessary. These were fairground cruisers.
Yes.
Good guys cruisers. Obviously,
we'll
Gary
be getting
Medder's
into that.
Good guys. That's popped up in the early 80s.
Yeah,
and
we'll
stuff.
be getting into that too.
So kind of just going down a little bit more of the road of the expansion of hot rods in the 80s. So get your long beards on. Get your
come on, man, your OP shorts, your
well,
lightning bolt
that's
t-shirt.
like later, isn't it?
No, this is the time right now.
This is the time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
this corduroy pants and terry cloth t-shirts. I got you covered.
So next time we're going back to the 80s.